According to a 2016 report by the OJP's Bureau of Justice Statistics, only 7% of the 18,000 law enforcement agencies across the US have a dedicated cold case unit. The lack of cold case units puts a significant strain on police forces, as their resources are constantly being stretched every year. It's estimated that there are 6,000 new unsolved cases each year, and with a large backlog, many of these cases will sit dormant for years. Number 5. John Bain Lyons and his wife looked out of their window, checking the weather for the evening. The evening of November 30th, 1948 was set to be a warm and pleasant one, so the two put on their shoes and went for a stroll along Somerton Beach near Adelaide, Australia. As the couple were making their way down the beach, they noticed a man lying in the sand, with his head propped up against the seawall, with his legs out in front of him and his feet crossed. They witnessed the man lifting his right arm before simply dropping it, and John joked to his wife that the man was probably a drunk who had found a sturdy place to rest while the alcohol wore off, and the two thought nothing of it. By the time they had finished their walk and were passing the area, they saw the same man again, but this time he was motionless. On their second time around, the Lyons began to notice that something was off about this man. He was dressed in a well-fitting suit and his shoes were impeccably shined. Bizarre attire for the beach. Nevertheless, the Lyons continued with their walk home and put the incident to the back of their minds. It wouldn't be until the next morning, December 1st, that the Lyons would understand what they had witnessed that night, and to this day, the case of the Somerton Beach man remains one of the most mysterious unsolved cases in Australian history. By 6:30 a.m. on December 1st, 1948, other passers-by had noticed the mysterious man too, and when they noticed that he hadn't moved, people began rushing to his aid, only to discover that his body was cold. He had passed sometime during the night, and police were quickly called to the scene. Onlookers assumed that the man was a drunk who had been exposed to the elements, but what police uncovered would lead them on a wild goose chase for over 73 years. Realizing that there was nothing they could do for the man, the South Australian police contacted the coroner and requested that the body be transported to the Royal Adelaide Hospital for an autopsy, and an investigation was officially opened. The police noted that neither the scene nor the man showed any signs of violence or a struggle, and that a half-smoked cigarette was found on his collar. Little did the police and coroner know that these were just some of the bizarre details surrounding his case. When the man's body was transported to the coroner's office, a full examination was conducted, and his belongings were searched in the hopes that it may lead them to an identity. Bizarrely, as the coroner and his assistants checked through his clothes, they realized that all of the tags had been cut out, and that one of his pockets had been repaired using a distinctive orange thread. Upon checking his pockets and looking through his personal belongings, they found nothing that could point to his identity, such as a wallet or an ID card. In his report, the coroner noted that the man had a pack of chewing gum, a metal comb, an Army Club cigarette packet that contained a mixture of cigarette brands, and an unused second-class rail ticket from Adelaide to Henley Beach. With initial reports of the man's discovery now hitting the headlines, the police hoped that somebody would come forward with information, but instead they were met with silence. The investigation continued, and the coroner carried out the autopsy later that day. But the results of this autopsy did little to clear the fog surrounding the case. In fact, the findings only confused investigators more. In his report, the coroner determined that the man had most likely passed away due to being poisoned, but he was unable to ascertain which one, as there was no trace of poison in the man's system. All of the signs pointed towards poison, but without the presence of any metabolites, the coroner was unable to determine anything. The police had hoped that the autopsy would have shed more light on the case, but instead it caused more confusion. With nowhere else left to turn, the South Australian police began circulating more information about the unknown man, who they dubbed the Somerton Beach Man. In his report, the coroner described the man as being 180 centimeters tall, with gray eyes and fair or ginger-colored hair that had started graying around the temples. Due to the graying of the man's hair, it was estimated that he was between 40 and 50 years old. The coroner also noticed that the man had very pronounced calf muscles that were consistent with someone who did ballet or wore high-heeled shoes. The South Australian police even circulated a copy of the man's fingerprints in the hopes that this description and record would prompt someone to come forward, but nobody did. The case captured the imagination of the public, and despite everyone's best efforts, to this day, the Somerton Beach Man remains unidentified. On January 10th, his body was embalmed and prepared for a funeral after the police had exhausted all of their efforts. Then, the police remembered that the Somerton Man had been found with a rail ticket from Adelaide to Henley, which pointed to the possibility that he had traveled from somewhere else in Australia. Working on this theory, they believed that the man had likely left some luggage somewhere else, such as a hotel or a train station, and officers were dispatched to search for any luggage that had gone unclaimed. On January 12th or 14th, depending on which source you read, officers made a breakthrough in the Somerton Man case when an employee at the Adelaide train station summoned them to a cloakroom. The employee told officers that on November 30th, an unknown man had left a brown suitcase there for safekeeping, and it's widely believed that this suitcase belonged to the Somerton Man. Officers eagerly cracked the suitcase open, hoping to find that its contents would finally shed some light on the mystery. But to their dismay, the contents revealed next to nothing about its owner, and the investigation was soon back at square one. Inside the suitcase, officers found a red checkered dressing gown, a pair of red felt slippers, 4 pairs of underwear, pajamas, razors, a pair of brown trousers, a screwdriver, a pair of scissors, and a stenciling kit. Just like before, most of the labels from the items had been removed, making it almost impossible to identify the man or figure out where the items had come from. However, there were labels in 3 items that bore the name of Keen, or T. Keen. Officers jumped for joy after making this discovery, hoping that this was the lead that they'd been so desperately searching for. They scoured through records and cross-referenced missing persons reports, only to realize that the name was frighteningly popular, and that tracking down everyone with that name would be an impossible task. Each lead that came in was quickly debunked or dismissed, and the South Australian police found themselves running in circles trying to figure out the identity of the Somerton Man, and determine once and for all what happened to him on November 30th, 1948. It wasn't until months after his body was discovered that another inquest would be ordered that would yield the police with their final and most mysterious clue yet. As the investigation began to stall and dwindle, the police became desperate in their attempts to solve it. Reaching out to the media had proved fruitless, and while several clues pointed to the man having been to the US, all requests for information turned up nothing. Then, in April of 1948, Dr. John Cleland of the University of Adelaide was brought onto the case to perform another autopsy and inquest. During this second inquest, Dr. Cleland found something very interesting. He examined the Somerton Man and his belongings with a fine-tooth comb, something that the first lot of investigators had failed to do. The original report noted that the man's pockets had been fixed with a waxy orange thread, but there were no mentions of this pocket being opened and examined. So Dr. Cleland decided to open the pocket up, and inside he found a chilling clue. Inside of the pocket, rolled up tightly, he found a scrap of paper that had 2 words printed on it: "To Mom Shud." Dr. Cleland stared at the piece of paper, trying to figure out what the words meant and how they were significant to the case. He passed the note around, asking his assistants and anyone present if they knew the significance of the note, but everyone shook their heads. It wasn't until the police reporter for the Adelaide Advertiser, Frank Kennedy, saw this note that the clue was cracked. Upon seeing the note and the words "to Mom Shud" written on it, Frank immediately called the police and Dr. Cleland and informed them that it was a Persian phrase meaning "it is ended," and that they could find the phrase in a rare 12th century poetry book. The police began hunting for a copy of this book, and more specifically were looking for a copy that shared the same features as the note found in the Somerton man's pocket. The reverse side of the paper was blank, and despite finding a few copies of the book, none of them matched the note found. None of them were blank on the back, and the search continued. Then, in July of 1948, an unnamed man walked into a police station in Adelaide, armed with a copy of the book with a small piece of the final page ripped out. According to the man who handed over the rare book, in December of 1948, shortly after the man's body was discovered, he had found the book on the rear seat of his brother-in-law's car. His brother-in-law kept the car parked by Somerton Beach, and after hearing about the case on the news, the man knew that the book and the location were of some significance in this case. He told officers that the two just assumed that the book belonged to the other, and it was neatly stored away in the glove compartment of the car for safekeeping. The two had forgotten about the book for months, but upon hearing news reports of the missing final sentence, the two knew that something was wrong. They quickly rushed to the car, opened the glove box, and flipped to the last page. Both men looked down at the book and then back at each other as they discovered that the final sentence from the last page had been torn out, where the words "to Mom Shud" should have been laid in empty space. The unknown man handed over the book to investigators, who quickly set about analyzing it, hoping that finally they had found the last piece in the puzzle that was the Somerton man. In the back of the book, they found a phone number that led them back to a nurse who lived in close proximity to Somerton Beach. Unfortunately, the nurse was unable to provide the investigators with useful information. She confirmed that she had given a copy of the book to a man named Alfred Boxall some years earlier during the war. It was later found that Alfred was alive and well, living in New South Wales, and still had his copy of the book that the nurse had given to him. So now investigators were left wondering how her phone number had been found in a copy of a rare book when the copy she had given away was accounted for. Investigators noted that the nurse was evasive during questioning and seemed to recognize the man and was taken aback when presented with a clay bust of his face, but still refused to divulge any information. With this lead at a dead end, investigators turned their attention back to the copy of the book that was found by the unknown man. Using UV light, forensic investigators uncovered yet another clue. The light allowed investigators to see indentions and impressions that had been left behind by someone writing on a piece of paper. These indentations were revealed to be a ciphered code that's 5 lines long and comprised of jumbled letters. Despite the best efforts of investigators and cryptologists, this code has never been cracked, and some believe that this is the last step in figuring out the Somerton man's identity and uncovering the truth of what happened to him on that November evening in 1948. In later years, a new witness came forward, claiming that he had seen a man carrying another on his shoulder near the water's edge of Somerton Beach. The witness wasn't able to give a description of either man, and it's unknown whether this sighting is connected with the Somerton man case. In 2021, the South Australian Police announced that they were working with forensic specialists to exhume the Somerton man's remains to obtain a DNA sample, and try to figure out where the man had come from and what his name was. If you have any information about the Somerton man case, you're asked to contact the South Australian Police Department at 131-444 or contact Crime Stoppers at 1-800-333-000. Number 4. 19-year-old Lisa Au was proud of her Chinese and Hawaiian heritage, and always made sure to participate in both cultures and honor them. Lisa was born in the town of Kailua, Hawaii. Not much is known about her early life, and the first pieces of information about Lisa start in 1982 when she was 19 years old, almost 20. In 1982, Lisa was working at a hair salon in Kailua, which is located on Oahu Island. By all accounts, life was going well for Lisa. She'd recently started dating Doug Holmes, who was attending the University of Hawaii, and she was slowly but surely finding her place in life and navigating through her early adult years. Sadly, those years were cut short in January of 1982, and Lisa's case has continued to haunt investigators for almost 40 years. January 20th, 1982 was a rainy day, and Lisa watched from the salon windows as the rain lashed down onto the sidewalk and road. As the end of her shift approached, she hoped in the back of her mind that the rain would subside and that she would be able to get to her car without getting soaking wet. Lisa had only just gotten her driving license on January 18, 1982, and was hesitant about driving in such conditions. As 9:45 p.m. approached, the rain continued to pour, and Lisa held back for a few minutes, hoping that it would settle down. As the minutes ticked by, the rain continued, and eventually Lisa decided to brave the weather. She gathered her things, said goodbye to her colleagues, and stepped out of the door of the Susan Beers salon where she worked for the last time. According to her colleagues, Lisa seemed fine and happy, and had been discussing her evening plans with them. She told them that she was driving to see her boyfriend, Doug, at his sister's apartment in Makiki, and that the three planned to have dinner and relax. On her way back to Makiki, Lisa stopped off at a local grocery store to pick up some food before jumping back into her car and heading off to Doug's sister's apartment. The dinner went without incident according to Doug and his sister. The three ate their food, talked for a while, and then at around 12:20 to 12:45 a.m., the two left his sister's apartment, said their goodbyes, and went their respective ways. This would be the last time that anyone would see Lisa alive, and in the coming days, a wide-scale investigation would be launched into her disappearance. As January 21st, 1982 rolled around, and the sun rose through the blinds of the Au home, Lisa's parents noticed that the house was eerily quiet. There was no sign of their daughter, which was extremely out of character. They knew that she had spent the evening with her boyfriend, Doug, but knew that she would have called them to let them know if she was staying over with him. As the hours passed and there was still no sign of Lisa, her parents picked up the phone and called Doug to see if he knew where she was. Both parties were horrified to hear that neither of them had heard from Lisa, and Doug quickly sprang into action, offering to help them search for their daughter. According to reports, Doug got into his car and began driving between Makiki and Kailua, looking for any sign of Lisa, and it was while he was driving down a highway that he made a horrifying discovery. On the side of the road, he found Lisa's car. It had been parked and abandoned, and most horrifyingly of all, there was no sign of Lisa. Doug called in his discovery to the Honolulu Police Department, who quickly arrived at the scene and took the details of Lisa's disappearance from Doug. The Honolulu police noticed that Lisa's window had been wound down, which struck them as odd, as there had been heavy rains the night before. The inside of Lisa's car was described as sopping wet, and there were between 2 and 3 inches of standing water on the floor of the car. Why would Lisa abandon her car and leave the window open? And more importantly, where had Lisa gone? During the forensic search of the car, investigators found another puzzling clue. Lisa's handbag had been neatly placed on the passenger seat, but there was something wrong. Her handbag was bone dry, a stark contrast to the sopping wet interior of her car. Investigators theorized that her handbag had been returned to the car later on in the evening. The Honolulu police searched through Lisa's handbag, looking for any signs that a robbery had taken place. But the only thing that was missing was her driver's license, something that she had cherished dearly since the day she received it on January 18th. None of the clues were adding up, and the evidence presented to the Honolulu police only confused the case further. Doug was questioned by the police, and some reports indicate that his face was covered in scratches. However, it's never been confirmed whether these are linked to Lisa's case. Doug has never been arrested or convicted in Lisa's case, and remains innocent until proven otherwise. In the aftermath of this discovery, Doug and Lisa's parents began printing flyers and appealing to the media for anyone with information about Lisa's whereabouts to come forward. The Honolulu Police Department also published details of Lisa's mysterious disappearance, and within days, missing person posters and flyers made their way around the island. Residents from across the island banded together to help find Lisa, offering their assistance in whatever way they could. For 10 days, the residents of Oahu held their breath, hoping that as they awoke each morning, they would be met with news reporting that Lisa had been found safe and sound. But sadly, that would not be the reality in Lisa's case. In the days following Lisa's disappearance, the police believed that Lisa had been kidnapped, and that the person responsible would be in contact soon. They hoped to be able to negotiate for Lisa's safe return. Sadly, instead of the positive outcome that everyone hoped for, news trickled through on January 31st that provided a bleak outcome to the case. On the morning of January 31st, a man jogging on Mount Tantalus near Tantalus Drive discovered Lisa's body in a ravine. The area is heavily wooded and has no lights for pedestrians, which told investigators that she'd been placed there purposefully, in the hopes that nobody would discover her. Due to the 10 days that had passed, Lisa's remains were in poor condition, and as such, a cause of death could not be fully determined. Lisa's parents were heartbroken at the news, and despite their appeals, interviews, and search efforts, their daughter had been found under the worst possible circumstances. Now Lisa's parents turned their attention to the person responsible, and put all of their energy into ensuring that whoever did this would be brought to justice. Almost 40 years later, Lisa's family are still waiting for that justice to be served. The Honolulu police began talking to people who were driving along the road that night, and came across a witness who reported seeing a car with grille lights tailing Lisa's car. The witness assumed that Lisa was being pulled over by an unmarked police car and went on their way. However, several other women came forward and told the Honolulu police that they'd been pulled over and assaulted by a man in an unmarked car posing as a police officer in the months leading up to Lisa's disappearance. The local news quickly got a hold of this story and ran rampant with it, accusing the police of protecting one of their own, and postulating that either police or someone posing as a police officer had been responsible. People began pointing out that Lisa's car window had been wound down, and that her driving license was missing, all signs that she could have been talking to an officer, or at least someone she believed to be an officer. In the months after the discovery of Lisa's body, the Honolulu Police Department discovered that Lisa's driver's license wasn't missing, and in fact, she had left it behind at the grocery store when she was signing a check. This is one of the many examples of how the police mishandled Lisa's case, which led her family to hire a private investigator. It transpired that the police had focused all of their efforts on an unnamed officer who was placed on leave while the investigation was pending. There were several reports of misconduct against this officer, and due to mounting public pressure, the Honolulu Police Department believed that he could have been responsible for what happened to Lisa. The investigation into the officer took over a year, and when the case was finally presented to the courts, there wasn't enough evidence to secure a conviction. Officers of the Honolulu Police Department told news outlets that the push to secure a conviction against the unnamed officer was motivated by mounting public pressure and not evidence. While focusing their attention on one suspect, the investigators neglected other parts of the investigation and resigned themselves to one outcome. After the unnamed officer was cleared of the charges, Lisa's body was sent to Los Angeles for another post-mortem, and the further failings of the Honolulu Police Department were uncovered. The coroner in Los Angeles commented that the coroner in Honolulu had done a brief job, and also noted that her remains had been placed into the coffin still in the police-issued body bag. The Los Angeles coroner also noted that the coffin was in a poor state, saying, quote, "There were still leaves and trash inside," and that Lisa's body hadn't even been washed after the initial autopsy. The Los Angeles coroner was horrified at what they had uncovered, and berated the Honolulu Police Department and services for the terrible job they had done. Forensic investigators and experts assigned to Lisa's case also claimed that her skull and jawbone had been misplaced. According to a Hawaiian news article, the Honolulu Police Department claims that these items were handed to the Honolulu Medical Examiner's Office, while the Honolulu Medical Examiner's Office claims they were placed back into Lisa's coffin following the second autopsy. The whereabouts of these bones have never been confirmed, and the only way to tell would be to exhume Lisa once more, causing more grief and pain for her family. With the lack of evidence in Lisa's case, all we're left to do is speculate. Some people believe that Doug, Lisa's boyfriend, is responsible, as he was seen with scratches on his face after Lisa went missing. The police also administered 2 lie detector tests which he failed, saying that he felt guilty because he should have driven her home that night. Years later, another witness came forward, claiming that they had seen a man in Lisa's car with her on the night that she disappeared, and that Lisa was either asleep or unconscious at the time. The Honolulu Police Department have never officially connected Doug to Lisa's case, and as of right now, he remains innocent until proven guilty. The next theory is that Lisa was a victim of the Honolulu Strangler, a serial killer that claimed the lives of 5 women in the 1980s. The first known victim of the Honolulu Strangler was 25-year-old Vicki Gale Purdy, who disappeared in May of 1985. Although Lisa may in fact be his first victim. Lisa's car was wiped clean of any evidence, but the Honolulu Police Department remain hopeful that DNA samples may prove useful in the future. The final theory that some people in Honolulu still hold on to is that Lisa was in fact targeted by a police officer or someone posing as a police officer. While the unnamed officer was cleared of any involvement, the circumstances surrounding her disappearance do allude to someone in a position of power being involved. People have pointed out that Lisa wouldn't have stopped and pulled over if she was being followed by a car, unless that car had police lights and the person who pulled her over presented themselves with an air of authority. Almost 40 years later, we're still no closer to finding out what happened to Lisa Au. Her parents have since passed away, and Lisa is buried next to her father at the Valley of the Temples Memorial Park in Honolulu. Anyone with information is urged to contact the Honolulu Police Department's Criminal Investigation Division on 808-723-3609. Number 3. 25-year-old Mary Schles was described by those who knew her as an extremely intelligent and bright young woman. In 1974, Mary was in the process of obtaining her master's degree after she'd graduated from the University of Minnesota with honors the previous year. As well as being academically gifted, Mary was linguistically gifted too. She spoke English, German, and Dutch, and had just started learning Japanese. She loved nothing more than traveling around the world and taking in new cultures and learning their language. Mary also had a huge love of horses and art, and a chance trip to an art show in February of 1974 would kickstart one of Minnesota's most baffling cold cases that has confused experts to this day. Mary's life was dominated by her love of horses and art, and she had no hesitations about hitchhiking to get where she wanted to go. She'd spent several months backpacking and hitchhiking around Europe, and felt comfortable taking rides with strangers. In today's time, we know that hitchhiking is a high-risk activity that many parents warn their children about. But in the 1970s, hitchhiking was the norm for youngsters who didn't have their own car and couldn't use the less-than-ideal transport infrastructure in the US. At around 10:30 a.m. on February 15, 1974, Mary left the apartment she shared with her roommate in Minneapolis, Minnesota, headed for an art show in Chicago. The 2 roommates said their goodbyes, not knowing that it would be the last time they saw each other, and that the next mention of Mary's name would come from news reports. Mary informed her roommate that she planned to hitchhike as far as Madison, Wisconsin, and from there she would make her own way to Chicago. Sadly, Mary never made it to the art show, and just hours later, a man driving in Elk Lake, Dunn County, Wisconsin, made a horrifying discovery. Dennis Anderson and his beloved dog had just finished up running their errands when they were on their way back home. Not wanting to waste the day, Dennis decided to take a longer route home, and he ended up driving down a dead-end road. As he joined onto the road, not knowing that it was a dead end, he passed what looked like two people having an argument in a car parked on the side of the road. As Dennis reached the end of the street, he realized that he'd driven into a dead-end street and spun his car around. This time, as he made his way down the road, he watched in horror from his rearview mirror as he saw the male occupant of the car throw a body onto the snowy embankment and speed away, quickly gaining speed with him. In a panic, Dennis rushed home and let his dog into the house. Unsure of what to do, he ran over to his neighbor, Dan Murphy's house, and asked for his help. Dennis's mind was clouded with panic, and all he could think was that somebody was hurt and in need of help. However, as they arrived at the snowy embankment and peered down, they realized that it was far too late. Below them was the body of 25-year-old Mary Schles. With a sick feeling in his stomach, Dennis rushed over to the nearest phone to report what he had found, and quickly returned to the scene to await the police. In the meantime, he and Dan stood quietly as they observed the scene and processed what they had just found. They wondered who could have been capable of such a thing, and felt a sickly sense of despair run through them. The Dunn County Sheriff's Office hastily attended the scene, and within minutes, the area had been cordoned off and was officially declared a crime scene. Dennis and Dan were asked to stand back as they watched the investigators do their job. One by one, they were taken aside and questioned by the officers, and Dennis recounted to them the events of that day. At the scene, officers found an orange and black stocking hat, and were luckily able to obtain hairs from it, but no matches could be found from them. Officers also tried to make impressions of the tire tracks near to where Mary's body had been found. However, the solution used to create the molds was rendered unusable due to the heavy snowfall from that morning. With only slivers of forensic evidence, the Dunn County Sheriff's Office knew that this was going to be a tough case to crack. They discovered that Mary's handbag and coat were missing from the scene, and that her hands bore defensive injuries, suggesting that she fought valiantly with her attacker. After speaking to Mary's roommate, investigators discovered that Elk Lake, Wisconsin, was in the opposite direction of where Mary was headed. They also noted that the dead-end road did not see heavy footfall, telling them that whoever was responsible was local to the area and that they knew they likely wouldn't be disturbed. The Dunn County Sheriff's Office worked closely with Dennis to create a sketch of the man he had seen that day, and this photo was circulated across Wisconsin, with the suspect being described as a white male between the ages of 25 and 35, 6 foot tall, and 180 pounds with medium-length auburn hair and a thick mustache. But nobody came forward with information. Dennis was horrified by what he had discovered that day, and vowed to work with the police to see an end to Mary's case, and that justice was served. He also even agreed to meet with the hypnotist to see if going under hypnosis would be able to help him recall more details that he had hidden in his subconscious memory. Each lead was chased to its end, but the Dunn County Sheriff's Office came up with nothing. Hundreds of man-hours were put into the investigation, but it quickly ran cold. The residents of Elk Lake felt for Mary and her family, but were unable to offer any assistance in her case. As such, her case remained cold. That was until 8 months later, when a very mysterious letter was sent to the Wisconsin Crime Lab. Receptionists at the lab were sorting through their daily mail when they came across a bizarre handwritten letter. Handwritten letters weren't unusual for the lab, but something about this letter in particular struck them as odd. As they opened it, they were met with a sinister note that read, quote, "Did you ever think the man who found the girl at Elk Lake also put her there?" This note clearly pointed the finger at Dennis Anderson, but as far as the Dunn County Sheriff's Office were concerned, Dennis was not involved. In the months and years after Mary's passing, the locals of Elk Lake have described ghostly goings-on in the area where Mary was discovered. There are countless stories of motorists seeing a young woman with long brown hair walking down the road looking for a ride. As soon as a driver approaches the young woman, her apparition disappears into the night. During a search of Mary's apartment, investigators found a black and white photo of an unidentified man. Investigators noted that the man in the photo bears a striking resemblance of the police sketch that was created with the help of Dennis Anderson, and they've asked for the public's help in identifying the man, hoping it may lead them one step closer to finding the person responsible. For the Dunn County Sheriff's Office, there's only one possible suspect that plays on their mind: Randall Woodfield, also known as the I-5 killer. At the time of Mary's case, Randall may have been in the area, although they've been unable to concretely prove this. Randall was known to find victims along the I-5 between California and Washington, and it may be possible that Mary fell victim to him. The most recent update in Mary's case came in 2009 when the Dunn County Sheriff's Office decided to exhume her body for further testing. Despite this exhumation, they were able to obtain 2 DNA samples from 2 separate people, although they're keeping very tight-lipped about this development. 47 years later, Mary's case remains open and unsolved. The Dunn County Sheriff's Office are keeping their cards close to their chest, most likely to preserve the integrity of the investigation. In recent years, they confirmed that the car spotted by Dennis was possibly an orange or gold compact car, and a sketch of the suspect is available to the public. If you have any information about Mary's case, you're urged to contact the Dunn County Sheriff's Office at 715-231-2917. Number 2. Niagara, North Dakota is a small farming town located in Grand Forks County, North Dakota. With just 44 residents in 2019, Niagara is the definition of a small, quiet farming community where everyone knows everyone else and also knows their business. In the early 1900s, everyone in Niagara thought they knew everyone's business. After all, with such a small population, it was impossible to hide anything. Then, in 1915, a shocking discovery put Niagara, North Dakota on the map for a very sinister reason. Eugene Butler was known around the small farming town of Niagara as a friendly but eccentric man, who was far wealthier than many people in the area. Eugene lived on his farm alone, deciding to spend his days tending to the farm and getting to work wherever he could. He preferred his own company, and townsfolk knew him to be a recluse. And although he was a little odd, he always appeared friendly. As the years passed, Eugene's behavior began escalating. The once odd and eccentric man devolved into something much scarier. His neighbors reported that he would ride his horses around at night, shouting at the top of his lungs. At first, the townsfolk ignored his bizarre behavior. However, when the strange incidents kept happening, they reported him to the police. When the townsfolk reflected upon Eugene Butler's bizarre behavior, they realized that since Eugene had moved to Niagara, coming from Buffalo, New York, he'd been displaying symptoms of mental illness. He would tell those in the local community that men would come up to his house at night, force him to get dressed, and take him on horse rides. In reality, Eugene had imagined the whole scenario, which may have explained why he rode around in the middle of the night, shouting. In 1906, it appears the isolation and years of backbreaking farm work had finally gotten to 54-year-old Eugene. Newspaper reports from the time indicate that he was involuntarily committed to an asylum in Jamestown, North Dakota, after he began rambling on that all of the women and widows wanted to marry him, and that he had women falling at his feet. This, combined with his late-night horse rides, had scared the local community so much that they'd called the police and reported Eugene, with police sending him to the aforementioned asylum. At the asylum, he was under the care of Dr. W.M. Hotchkiss, who kept a close eye on Eugene and noted down his strange behavior and increasing paranoia. According to Hotchkiss, Eugene was specifically paranoid about someone being after him, and at the time, Hotchkiss thought he was dealing with a severe type of mental illness. However, the discovery in 1915 would make Hotchkiss question whether Eugene was unwell, or whether he was being haunted by the ghosts of his past. Eugene Butler remained under the care of Dr. Hotchkiss and his team at the asylum until he passed away in 1913. Those who had worked with Eugene remarked that he'd been a troubled patient, but overall showed no signs of violence or violent tendencies to others. In fact, they believed that he was more harmful to himself with his paranoid tendencies. Following Eugene's passing, his estate was divided up between his family, who traveled from Buffalo, New York to sort out who would receive what. According to reports, Eugene's farm was worth between $40,000 and $50,000, which, when adjusted for inflation, makes the property worth about $1.1 million today. This was by no means a small sum of money, and his family made sure that the estate was taken care of properly. In the end, they decided that the best course of action was to renovate the farm. Regardless of what their intentions were for the property, they hired workmen to excavate the farm and get it ready for remodeling under the instruction of a lawyer. On a warm June day in 1915, a workman named Leo picked up his tools and got ready for a hard day's work ahead of him. It's important to note that there are some sources that state Leo had purchased the property and was excavating independently to prepare his new house. As he began digging a cellar, he came across something hard in the dirt. He continued to dig and saw something white sticking out. The more he dug, the more horrified he became, and when he was finished, he realized that he discovered 6 human skeletons. Leo ran as fast as he could to the closest house and summoned the police to the scene. They confirmed that there were 6 skeletons in total, and that Eugene Butler was a serial killer. The residents of Niagara and the surrounding areas were shocked when news hit the headlines. They knew that Eugene was a strange and odd person, but could never have suspected that he would be responsible for something like this. There was something else that puzzled the townsfolk too. No one in Niagara had ever been reported missing, so who did the bodies belong to? The news spread around the town like wildfire, and people began speculating that the bodies perhaps belonged to Eugene's family, and that's why he lived a reclusive life. This theory was quickly debunked when anthropologists were able to examine the bones and determined that they belonged to men over the age of 18. The prevailing theory is that these bodies belonged to farmhands, but no motive has ever been determined. With this grim discovery, the police now had the task of identifying the bodies, and this is where they ran into a problem. No one in the area had been reported missing, and no one came forward to claim them. Over 100 years later, the Grand Forks County Sheriff's Office is still no closer to identifying the 6 men found on Eugene Butler's farm. All files and records pertaining to the case have either been lost or destroyed, and it's unlikely the mystery will ever be solved. Number 1. To the outside world, 39-year-old Charles Curtis Morgan, who went by the nickname Chuck, was an ordinary family man and a successful businessman living in Tucson, Arizona, with his wife Ruth and his 4 daughters. The Morgans lived an unassuming life, with Chuck's part of an escrow business providing the family with everything they could have asked for and more. Behind closed doors, Chuck was hiding a dark secret though, that even his family didn't know about. But the events of March 22nd, 1977 would change all of that and set into motion one of Arizona's most bizarre cold cases. On March 22nd, Chuck got 2 of his children ready for school and dropped them off as usual. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, and there was nothing to indicate that Chuck was in any sort of danger. As nighttime fell, there was no sign of Chuck. He failed to return home, and his wife was unable to contact him. At the time of his disappearance, Chuck was a potential witness in a state land fraud case against an organized crime boss. 3 days passed, and there was still no sign of Chuck. Then at around 2 a.m., Ruth was awoken by a loud thud at the back door. She recalled the events of that evening to Unsolved Mysteries, telling them, quote, "I was in bed and the dog started barking. I got up, went to the door and opened it, and there was Chuck. He was missing a shoe and had one plastic handcuff around one ankle and had a set around his hands. He motioned to his throat and didn't say a word, and I asked him, 'Can you talk? "Can you write?" He shook his head yes, so I went and got a tablet and a pen. He wrote that his throat had been painted with a substance and that it could drive him irrevocably insane or destroy his nervous system. I wanted to call a doctor and the police, but he was adamant that it would be extremely dangerous for the entire family. Confronted with her husband, disheveled and handcuffed, Ruth hurried him inside, and over the course of the next week or so, she helped him regain his strength and nurse him back to health. As the days wore on, Chuck felt more confident about speaking, and his voice slowly returned. Chuck also begged Ruth to move his car and any indication that he may have come back home, as he didn't want them to know that he was there. Ruth pressed him for more details, but each time he refused to divulge who they were. Chuck also began talking in cryptic sentences and became increasingly paranoid. Ruth told Unsolved Mysteries, quote, "He wrote, 'They took my treasury identification. That was the first time I'd heard of it. Then he told me that he'd been working for them for about 2 or 3 years, and that was it.'" Chuck began alluding to the fact that he was an undercover agent of sorts for the Treasury, and that his disappearance was not random. According to journalist Don Devereaux, who worked on the case for the TV show Unsolved Mysteries, quote, "Chuck was around the edges of a couple of very large organized crime groups in Arizona at the time. It was very easy to get in over your head, and I suspect that over the years, Mr. Morgan was in that kind of situation." Is it possible that Chuck, who had once worked alongside organized crime groups, had now turned into a secret Treasury agent who was due to testify against the very groups that he had worked with? According to Chuck's family, he told them very little about work, remarking that the less they knew, the better off they would be. In the wake of Chuck's disappearance, Ruth began to wonder whether Chuck was involved with something much darker than escrow. After the events of March 22nd, 1977, Chuck became incredibly paranoid. He wore a bulletproof vest everywhere he went, and made sure that he and he alone dropped his daughters off at school. He took no chances in regards to his family's personal safety, and no matter how much Ruth pressed the issue, Chuck always remained quiet and told her that it was for her own good. Life for the Morgans continued with Chuck's paranoid behavior and routines dominating their lives. They wondered when, if ever, their lives would go back to normal. But then on June 7th, 2 months after Chuck initially disappeared, the unthinkable would happen. When Chuck failed to return home and failed to contact his wife, his family knew that something bad had happened again. Ruth waited night and day for Chuck to call her or get a message to her, and on the 9th day, after his second disappearance, the phone rang. On the other end of the line, a woman's voice said, "Ruthie?" To which Ruth replied, "Yes." The seconds of silence that followed felt like hours for Ruth. Then the silence was broken by the mysterious woman saying, quote, "Chuck is all right, Ecclesiastes 12, 1-8. She then hung up the phone. As the dead call tone rang through Ruth's ears, she racked her brain, thinking what significance Ecclesiastes 12 held. To this day, investigators and online sleuths still debate the relevance of this passage and its connection to Chuck. Was the mysterious woman on the other end of the phone trying to tell Ruth something? Or was this a mocking call from Chuck's captors? 2 days later, Chuck's body was discovered in the Arizona desert, just off the highway of San Juan Springs. He had been wearing a bulletproof vest, but this wasn't enough to save him. Laid next to him was a .357 Magnum, and gunshot residue on his left hand confirmed that he had been the one to fire it. The local police quickly jumped to the assumption that Chuck had taken his own life. They discovered a handwritten note with directions to the area, and Ruth confirmed that it was Chuck's handwriting. The bizarre clues didn't stop here, though. In the back seat of his car, one of his teeth was found neatly wrapped in a white handkerchief, and nobody was able to determine how he had lost the tooth. Upon searching his body, a $2 note was found inside of his underwear that had 7 Spanish names on it, from A to G. Also written on the note were the words Ecclesiastes 12, with the verses of 1-8 being marked by arrows pointing to the bill's serial numbers. These were the same Bible verses that were reiterated to Ruth in the mysterious phone call just 2 days earlier, and investigators were at a loss in terms of its significance. Despite all of the bizarre evidence in front of them, investigators determined that Chuck had taken his own life, something that Ruth heavily disputed. Ruth told investigators that Chuck wouldn't do something like this, and Chuck's father also testified that in the days before his second disappearance, Chuck told him that something was going to happen to him. At the scene, what has been described as a crudely drawn map was found that showed several roads to the towns of Robles Junction and Solicity, which sit between Tucson and the Mexican border. These towns are known for their connections to smuggling and organized crime groups who operate between the two countries. 2 days later, a mysterious woman, calling herself Green Eyes, called the sheriff's office asking to speak to officers about Chuck Morgan. She told officers that Chuck had met with her shortly before his passing, and that he had shown her a suitcase crammed full of money that he was going to hand over to the mob in exchange for his life. She also told investigators that she had been the one who placed the call to Ruth. The sheriff's office were unable to get any more details from the woman before she hung up. Unfortunately, she never called back again. Even after Chuck's passing, Ruth found no peace. Her life had completely turned upside down and the mystery continued. Weeks after Ruth had buried Chuck, 2 men who claimed to be FBI agents showed up at her door and demanded to have a look around. It appears the 2 men didn't find what they were looking for, and after tearing the house apart, they abruptly left without giving their names or branch information. What's more is that Don Devereaux, the journalist who worked with Unsolved Mysteries, filed a Freedom of Information Act request to obtain any information that the FBI had about Chuck Morgan's case. To his surprise, the FBI returned and said that there was no record of Chuck. In 2006, Ruth Morgan passed away without ever knowing what happened to her husband. Chuck Morgan left behind 4 children who are still searching for answers and justice for what happened to their father. As far as the sheriff's office is concerned, Chuck's case is closed, but other investigators and amateur sleuths believe otherwise. If you have any information about Chuck's case, you're asked to contact Unsolved Mysteries via their website. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But I've been Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.